Claude responded. My son-in-law told me I wouldn't be needed at Thanksgiving this year while I was still holding the turkey baster I'd bought specifically because my late wife, My son-in-law told me I wouldn't be needed at Thanksgiving this year while I was still holding the turkey baster I'd bought specifically because my late wife always said the drippings mattered more than the bird. Grace wants her real dad there, he said, not even looking up from his phone. It'll just be easier if you sat this one out, Walter. I set the baster down on the counter. Not hard. I didn't throw it or raise my voice. I just placed it next to the roasting pan because my fingers had gone numb around it. It was November 9th, a Tuesday, and I remember the exact time because the evening news was just starting behind him on the kitchen TV 6 p.m. My daughter Melissa had left the room 10 minutes earlier to take a call, and Curtis, her husband, had wandered in to grab a beer. And somehow, standing there in my own kitchen, in the house I'd helped them put a down payment on 12 years ago, I felt like a stranger who'd overstayed a visit. Grace is 9, I said. She calls me Papa Walt. I've been to every one of her dance recitals since she could walk. I know that. Curtis had the decency to look a little uncomfortable. But Roger's back in the picture now, and Melissa thinks it'd mean a lot to Grace if her biological grandfather got some real time with her. Roger's never really had that. Roger. My late wife Dorothy's first husband, Melissa's biological father. A man who'd left when Melissa was 4 and resurfaced maybe 6 times in the 30 years since, usually around holidays, usually when something in his life had fallen apart. I had married Dorothy when Melissa was 5. I had walked Melissa down the aisle. I had been in the delivery room when Grace was born because Melissa's actual father hadn't answered his phone in 8 years. None of that apparently made me real. Does Melissa know you're telling me this? I asked. Curtis shifted his weight. It was kind of a family decision I wasn't part of. Walter, come on. Don't make this into something it isn't. I'm asking a simple question. For whom would it be awkward if I came? He didn't answer that. His phone buzzed on the counter, screen up this time, and I caught Roger's name before Curtis flipped it face down, a reflex too quick to be innocent. Something in my chest went very quiet, the way water goes still right before it freezes. Is Roger bringing anyone? I asked. That's not really the point. That answer told me plenty on its own. I thought about the summer Grace had bronchitis, and I'd sat up 3 nights in a row in the pediatric ward because Melissa had back-to-back shifts at the hospital where she worked, and Curtis was traveling for his sales job. I thought about teaching Grace to ride a bike in the church parking lot 2 blocks from here, running behind her with one hand hovering under the seat, the same parking lot where I'd once taught Melissa the same thing 26 years earlier. None of it evidently qualified as real. I've raised that girl's mother since she was 5 years old, I said quietly. I raised Grace's mother. I don't know what else earns the word real if that doesn't. Nobody's saying you didn't do a good job. Curtis said it the way you'd compliment a contractor. Good job, solid work, reliable. The word landed exactly like an insult, because I understood, suddenly and completely, that good had become the polite way of saying replaceable. I picked up my coat from the hook by the door. My hands were steadier than I expected. Tell Melissa, I hope she has a nice Thanksgiving, I said, and I left before he could see whatever was happening on my face. I drove home to my empty house Dorothy had passed 18 months earlier, and the house still had her reading glasses on the nightstand because I hadn't found a way to move them yet, and I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. On the passenger seat was a small gift bag. Inside it, a charm bracelet with a tiny silver treble clef, because Grace had just started violin lessons and mentioned once, in passing, that she loved the shape of the note G, written in sheet music. I'd ordered it 3 weeks ago. I left it on the seat. Inside the house, my laptop was still open on the kitchen table from that afternoon. An email sat in my inbox, subject line, Final decision needed Coastal Division consulting role, Wilmington, NC. My old engineering firm, the one I'd retired from 4 years ago at 61, had been begging me for over a year to come back part-time as a senior consultant on a coastal infrastructure project. 6 months, generous pay, company housing near the water. I'd turned it down twice already, both times because Dorothy was still alive and didn't want to relocate, and once more just 8 months ago because Melissa had asked me to stay close in case Grace needed picking up from school. The offer expired at 5 p.m. the next day. I called my younger brother, Frank, who still lived 2 states away in the house we grew up in. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Everything all right? He asked. No, I said, and I told him what Curtis had said, standing in my own kitchen with a beer in his hand, telling me a 9-year-old's biological grandfather deserved my seat at the table. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Would you still want that consulting job if Melissa called you tomorrow and apologized?" "I don't know." "Then don't decide tonight. I've already said no to it twice." "That's not the same as saying no to it angry." "I'm not angry." "Walt, you're a 65-year-old man calling his little brother at 9 at night, 3 hours after getting told you're not real family. You're angry." I laughed, despite myself, a short, tired sound. Then Frank's voice softened. "Don't take that job just to make a point to people who already made up their minds about you. That's still letting them decide what your life is about." I didn't sleep much that night. At 7:40 the next morning, I opened the email again. I read the salary, the housing terms, the project scope, a new seawall system for a stretch of coastline that flooded every hurricane season, the kind of work that had made me proud for 35 years. Then I thought about another holiday like the one that was coming. "Welcome to sit in the den if you want, Papa Walt, but let's not make a thing of it." I thought about all the years I'd made myself smaller so the room could stay comfortable for everyone else. I clicked accept. My hands shook afterward, not from excitement, from the understanding that, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I'd made a decision nobody else had gotten a vote on. Melissa called that afternoon, her voice bright and rehearsed in a way that told me Curtis had briefed her. "Dad, I heard there was some confusion about Thanksgiving. I just think, with Roger finally wanting to be involved, it could be really healing for Grace to have that time. You understand, right?" "I understand you didn't call me yourself last night," I said. "I was going to." "When?" She didn't answer that either. "I'm not going to fight you on Thanksgiving, Melissa," I said. "I'm taking a consulting job in North Carolina. I leave in 3 weeks." The silence on the line lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "You're just leaving? Because of one dinner?" "This dinner didn't create anything," I said. It just finally said out loud what's been true for a while. She didn't have an answer for that, and I let the silence sit there instead of filling it the way I always used to. I spent the next 3 weeks doing something I hadn't done since Dorothy got sick, thinking only about myself. I called my attorney, an old friend named Harold who'd handled Dorothy's estate, and asked him a question I'd never had to ask before. What happens to Grace's college fund, the one I'd been quietly contributing to since she was born, if I'm not in the state to manage it directly? Harold walked me through converting it into an irrevocable trust in Grace's name alone, structured so that neither Melissa nor Curtis, nor, God forbid, Roger could ever touch the principal. It wasn't punishment. It was protection for her, not from her. I sold the recliner Dorothy hated and gave away half the furniture in that big empty house. I kept my father's toolbox, our wedding photos, and a small wooden jewelry box Dorothy had left specifically for Grace to be given to her on her 16th birthday. I packed that box between 2 sweaters, the same careful way Dorothy used to wrap Christmas ornaments. 2 nights before I left, Grace called me on her mother's phone. "Papa Walt, are you really moving?" "I am. Sweetheart, just for a while. For work." "Mom said you were mad at us." I closed my eyes for a second. "I'm not mad at you, not even a little." "Is it because of Grandpa Roger coming to Thanksgiving?" "Kids hear more than we think they do." "Did your mom tell you that's why?" "No." I heard Dad on the phone. A pause. "Are you coming back?" "I'll always come back for you," I said, and I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything in my life. I left for Wilmington on a gray Thursday in early December. The consulting firm had arranged a small, furnished apartment 3 blocks from the water, and my first morning there, I stood on a balcony overlooking a marsh I didn't recognize yet, drinking coffee out of a mug that wasn't Dorothy's, in a kitchen that smelled like nothing familiar. And I let myself feel exactly how strange and clarifying that was. The project itself turned out to be a mess. The seawall design had been stalled for 8 months because the county engineers and the state contractors had stopped speaking to each other directly, routing every disagreement through email chains nobody read fully. My first week, I sat through a planning meeting where 2 grown men argued about drainage elevation for 40 minutes without once looking at the actual survey data sitting in front of them. My project lead, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise Okafor, pulled me aside afterward. "You know why corporate really brought you down here?" she asked. "To fix the drainage math?" "No, because nobody trusts anybody on this project anymore, and you don't have a horse in the fight yet." She wasn't wrong. It reminded me, more than I expected, of my own family, 2 sides, so certain of their own version of events that nobody had bothered checking the paperwork, which was exactly what happened 3 weeks later. Melissa, apparently trying to loop Curtis in on something related to Grace's orthodontist bills, accidentally forwarded me an email meant for him. The subject line read, "Household restructuring options if Dad doesn't come around." Attached was a spreadsheet. I sat at my kitchen table in Wilmington and opened it, and for a long moment I genuinely thought I'd misread it. It listed my retirement accounts Melissa had access to only because she was listed as an emergency contact after Dorothy passed. It listed the value of my house back home, still unsold. It listed a rough estimate of what my life insurance policy would pay out. At the bottom, a note in Curtis's handwriting style, clearly meant for Melissa. "If your dad won't help finance the restaurant with Roger, we need a fallback. Maybe he softens up once Grace visits him more." Roger, a restaurant. My retirement accounts itemized like assets on a loan application. I called Harold immediately. It was almost 9 at night in Wilmington by the time he picked up. "You're looking at it right now?" he asked. "I'm looking at it right now." "Walk me through what you see." "My 401k balance, my house equity, my life insurance payout, all of it, laid out like a spreadsheet for a bank loan." Harold was quiet for a second. "Walt, people put together documents like that for a lot of reasons. Estate planning, insurance reviews, honest financial conversations between family. That's not what the note says." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. What is it then?" "It reads like something somebody's using to convince a lender or convince themselves that you're a resource, not a father." I stared at the numbers on the screen until they stopped looking like numbers and started looking like an inventory of my entire life, weighed and measured by two people who apparently believed I existed to be spent. "I did some digging this afternoon before you called," Harold said. "Roger, Melissa's biological father, filed paperwork for an LLC 8 weeks ago. Coastal Table Hospitality Group. A restaurant, a concept for one. No location secured, no permits filed yet." I heard him typing. "This isn't his first business either. 2 prior LLCs, both dissolved within 18 months. 1 unpaid state tax lien. A vendor sued him over an unpaid catering deposit 4 years ago. So he's not some criminal mastermind." "No," Harold said. "He's something a lot more common. A man who's always one investor away from finally making it. I'd known men like that my whole career. Every year, a new venture, a new can't-miss opportunity, the story always changing, the ending never quite arriving." I told Harold not to do anything yet. I wanted to talk to Grace first, not to interrogate a 9-year-old, but because I needed to understand what she'd actually witnessed, if anything, before I made a single decision that might touch her life. I called 2 days later, on a Sunday, when I knew she'd be home from her dance class. "Papa Walt." Her face filled the screen, bright and unguarded in the way only kids can manage. "Did you see the water yet? Mom said you live by the ocean now." "Close enough to smell it," I said, smiling despite everything sitting heavy in my chest. "How was Thanksgiving, sweetheart?" Her smile faded slightly. "It was weird. Grandpa Roger talked the whole time about his new restaurant. He had like a whole presentation on his laptop. Nobody really talked about me." "What kind of presentation?" She shrugged, the universal gesture of a child repeating something she doesn't fully understand. "Like money stuff. He kept saying if you helped, everybody's problems would be fixed." Mom got kind of quiet. My stomach tightened. "Did your mom say anything back?" Grace hesitated, the way kids do when they sense they've wandered into adult territory. I heard her tell Dad, later, that families are supposed to help each other no matter what. Families share everything. I'd heard some version of that sentence my whole life, always aimed at me, never really meaning what it claimed to mean. "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I need you to just tell me the truth, okay? Did you want Grandpa Roger there instead of me, or did you just want to see him too?" She thought about it seriously, the way 9-year-olds do when you finally treat them like their answer matters. "I wanted to see him. I didn't know it meant you couldn't come. I thought maybe he'd, actually be around now." "That's not a silly thing to want," I told her, and I meant it. "Are you mad at me?" "Not even a little bit. I promise you that." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, an oddly grown-up gesture on such a young face. "I miss you at dinner." "I miss you too, sweetheart, more than you know." Melissa called less than an hour after I hung up with Grace. I let it ring twice before answering. "You talked to her behind my back," she said. "No greeting at all. She's my granddaughter. I don't need permission to ask how her holiday was." You're turning her against me. I haven't said one negative word about you to that little girl, Melissa, and I don't intend to. A pause. Then quieter. You saw the spreadsheet. I did. It wasn't what it looked like. Then tell me what it looked like. She started fast, the way people do when they've rehearsed an explanation they don't quite believe themselves. We were just being organized, thinking about the future. Roger's finally trying to build something stable, and I thought if we all worked together. Was Thanksgiving about Grace getting time with her biological grandfather? I asked. Or about warming me up to finance his restaurant afterward? The silence answered before she did. I never wanted you to feel replaced, she finally said. I love you. You know that. I believe that you love me, I said. But somewhere along the way, you stopped thinking my presence in this family had value beyond what I could provide. She didn't have a response to that. Neither of us did, for a long moment. Then I told her, gently, that I'd be flying home in 6 weeks for a company conference, and that we'd talk more then with Harold present and with the actual numbers on the table instead of assumptions. Those 6 weeks in Wilmington changed something in me I hadn't expected. Denise and I finally cracked the drainage dispute by simply making both engineering teams sit in the same room with the same survey data instead of trading emails, the same lesson. Again, that distance and assumption breed more damage than disagreement ever does. On weekends, I started walking the marsh trail near my apartment, and I met a retired shrimp boat captain named Earl who taught me how to identify egrets from herons, which felt like an absurdly small thing to be grateful for, and yet somehow wasn't. I also, slowly, started sleeping through the night again for the first time since Dorothy passed. The night before my flight home, I sat on my balcony with a glass of bourbon and called Frank. You nervous? He asked. Some. Good, he said. Means you still care how it turns out. Just don't let caring turn back into disappearing yourself again. I flew into town on a bright, cold Saturday in late January. Melissa had arranged for all of us, her, Curtis, Harold, and at my insistence, Roger to meet at Harold's office downtown, overlooking the river. Grace stayed home with a sitter. This wasn't a conversation for a 9-year-old to sit through, whatever its outcome. Roger arrived last, wearing a blazer that looked freshly purchased for the occasion, carrying a leather portfolio like a man walking into a pitch meeting rather than a family reckoning. He shook my hand with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once considered that this meeting might not go his way. Walter, good to finally sit down man to man, he said. Harold gestured to a chair. Mr. Whitfield, there's a price tag still on your sleeve. Roger glanced down, flustered, and yanked the little plastic tag loose, laughing it off. Must have missed that one. Nobody else laughed. Harold laid it out plainly, and without theatrics, the spreadsheet, dated 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Roger's 2 dissolved LLCs and the unpaid tax lien. The unsigned financing proposal Roger had circulated to Melissa and Curtis, in which my retirement accounts were listed explicitly as potential collateral under the heading Family Investment Pathway. This is exactly the kind of thing people blow out of proportion, Roger said, waving a hand. It was a draft. A concept. You expected my father-in-law to guarantee your restaurant, Curtis said, and I noticed for the first time real discomfort crossing his face. I expected Melissa to have an honest conversation with her father, Roger said. That's all. So you did expect it, Harold said. Melissa turned toward Roger, something breaking loose in her expression. You told me this could bring our family back together, that Grace could finally have both her grandfathers close. I said maybe, Roger said, shrugging in that same infuriatingly light way. I said we'd see how things landed. You said we'd rebuild something. I was keeping an open mind. That single sentence seemed to collapse something in her all at once, the recognition, arriving 30 years too late, that Roger had never actually promised her anything solid in her entire life, and she had spent one holiday season chasing a ghost of a father while quietly pricing out the real one sitting across the table. I didn't say much through most of it. I hadn't come to win an argument. When there was finally a lull, I spoke. I don't want revenge, I said. I never did. I want fairness, and I want Grace protected from all of it, permanently. I told them about the trust Harold had drawn up Grace's college fund, fully hers, untouchable by anyone, including me if I ever changed my mind out of guilt. I told Melissa I intended to keep being her father in every way that mattered, but that my finances were no longer a family resource to be strategized around, and that conversation was closed, permanently. Melissa cried, quietly, not performing it for anyone. "I'm sorry," she said. "I let myself believe the fantasy that if Roger finally showed up, it would fix something in me that's been broken since I was 4. I used you to try to buy that fantasy. I know that now." "I believe you're sorry," I said. "That doesn't mean everything goes back to how it was. But it means we can build something real from here, slowly." She nodded, wiping her face. "I'd like that." As the meeting broke up, Roger, of all things, asked Harold whether the building validated parking. Harold looked at him for a long moment. "After this morning," he said, "I think the walk will do you good." I nearly laughed out loud for the first time in months. I stayed in town for 4 more days before flying back to Wilmington. On my last evening, Melissa asked if she could bring Grace over to my hotel for dinner. Just the 3 of us. Grace ran across the lobby and hugged me so hard I nearly lost my footing. And over dinner, she talked for 20 straight minutes about her violin recital, barely pausing for breath. And I realized somewhere around the second course that I was smiling in a way I hadn't in over a year. Before she left, she handed me a small folded drawing crayon, a lopsided house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it, labeled Mom, Papa Walt, Grace. Underneath, in her careful 9-year-old handwriting, "My real family." I kept that drawing in my breast pocket on the flight back to North Carolina. The following months unfolded quietly, the way most real repair actually does not one dramatic conversation, but dozens of small, unremarkable ones. Melissa and Curtis separated for a time to work through what Roger's reappearance had exposed in their own marriage, and eventually reconciled on steadier terms, this time without Roger anywhere near their financial decisions. Roger's restaurant concept never secured funding from anyone else either. And by early spring, Grace mentioned, almost as an aside during one of our Sunday calls, that Grandpa Roger had moved to Georgia for a new opportunity. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. I finished out my consulting contract in Wilmington, and the seawall project came in ahead of schedule, largely because Denise and I had finally gotten both engineering teams to trust each other's numbers again. At the closing ceremony, the county administrator specifically thanked me for what she called restoring confidence between 2 teams who'd stopped listening to one another. And I thought, standing there, that it was the second time in 6 months I'd fixed exactly that same problem in 2 very different corners of my life. I bought a modest condo near the marsh instead of moving back into the big empty house full of Dorothy's ghosts, though I kept it and visit twice a year, mostly for Grace's sake. Earl and I still walk the trail most Saturday mornings. Melissa flies down with Grace every summer now, and last July, sitting on my balcony while Grace pointed out an egret she'd learned to identify herself, she turned to me out of nowhere and said, to no one in particular but loud enough for the whole table to hear, "This is my Papa Walt. He's my real grandpa." I had to look down at my plate for a second until my eyes cleared. People sometimes ask me whether moving to Wilmington was some kind of quiet revenge against my daughter and her husband. It wasn't. Neither was the trust I set up for Grace. Neither was Roger eventually disappearing again, this time on his own, without anyone pushing him out the door. The real turning point had happened earlier than any of that, the moment I stopped believing that being loved required me to accept being treated as optional. Walking away from that kitchen didn't erase what Curtis said to me, or what Melissa let happen in her silence. It just finally gave that wound room to close. If you've ever been told in ways loud or quiet that the years you gave someone don't count as real, I hope you know there's a life waiting on the other side of walking away with your dignity intact. Thank you for listening to my story, Claude responded. Being needed and being loved aren't always the same thing, and that's okay. Real family isn't proven by blood or by who shows up when it's convenient, but by being needed and being loved aren't always the same thing. And that's okay. Real family isn't proven by blood or by who shows up when it's convenient, but by who stays through the ordinary Tuesdays. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away with your dignity and trust that the people who truly love you will find their way back to the truth and to you. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its little life lesson still finds a warm place in your heart.